everybody. Ahla wa sahla bil-jamia. Welcome to Psychic Militancy. Before we get started in a live stream that I'm so excited about, please subscribe to the channel, send it to a comrade, tell everybody that we're having this conversation. I know folks are struggling right now and there's a lot going on. So this conversation promises to help me, at least. I'm excited for this conversation to help continue ground us and keep us sort of focused on what's ahead. Welcome to my comrades. Maura and Michel are here with me. And folks, we're having this conversation. It's called Kicking Power in the Shins. And I'm going to thank Maura for that one. When we were having this conversation about what do we call this, Maura sort of just threw out, like, I'm looking forward to doing this. And I think that's exactly it. So my framing to this is, you know, all of us, I think, here have been targets of Zionist smear campaigns on our campuses. That's part of what we were going to talk about. But locating it within the current moment, I want us also to think about, if we're thinking about Zionism as an ideology, as an expansionist ideology, I want us to be very clear, and I think I share that with my comrades here, that this is not separate from the Zionist aggression that we're seeing, the US-backed Zionist aggression that we're seeing in Iran, in Palestine, in Lebanon, in Syria, across the region, the so-called Middle East. That one of the things that we know and that we've talked about, and I hope we can get into today, is that every space becomes contested space when we're talking about Zionism and certainly empire and the ways in which these ideologies and sort of systems of violence work together to silence, to disappear, to make sure that power is not called out. But here are two folks who refuse to be disappeared, who refuse to shut the fuck up, and who join me in kicking power in the shins. So welcome, comrades. I'm so happy to have you here with me.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here with both of you. Thanks for making this space.
Of course.
Same here. Thank you for inviting us, and I've learned so much from both of you. From you, Maura, your courage, speaking truth to power, and you, Lara, you've given me personally such a foundation to understand how structure meets the individual in sustaining what my comrade Professor Seng Kiel calls the Zionist lying machine. You know, so thank you for your work.
Oh my gosh, thank you both so much. So maybe that's where we start. You know, I think a lot of folks might know you both, but just in case we don't, and also people know us and then people might not know all the moving pieces. I know one of the things we were talking about as we were planning this was like the mechanics and the pieces and so much that happens that doesn't ever end up making it into the public around being the target of these Zionist smear campaigns. So maybe we can start there, just sort of locating yourself, introducing yourself, starting us off with whatever you feel might be important for folks to know, and then we'll go from there. Maura, do you want to start?
Please, Maura.
Sure. Thank you. I think the way that I want to frame this, or my story within this larger story, is that what so many of us have experienced over and over and over again over the past, I don't even want to say 2.5 years, I want to say like 20 plus years. I'm thinking about like the case of Samuel Aryan, I'm thinking about Steve Salaita, I'm thinking about you, Lara, I'm thinking about this like long history of Zionist repression, specifically in higher ed and on our college and university campuses. And the thing that I'm just so struck by, and we're seeing echoes of this, we're seeing echoes of the Iraq War in these new attacks on Iran, is that the Zionist playbook is the same thing over and over again. It might have like different iterations, but we're seeing, you know, just as like all of us experienced to some extent this sort of like crying victim from Zionists, in which we are trying to do our work, we are trying to do our jobs, and our work and our jobs is being seen as like an attack. We're seeing the same sort of like created specter of threat, and we're actually seeing that the ones who are crying threat are empire. So I think like with my experience, what I found was that these Zionist students, staff, faculty, donors were lying in wait, building archives, strategizing for a very, 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 very long time. And I think, for Michel and I, not so much for you because your story preceded this, but Al-Aqsa flood provided the opening for so many of these attacks to emerge. So one of the things that I think is really interesting is that to some extent, all of us have been targeted by Hillel International, which is a Zionist organization that is actually part of corporate power, but pretends to be a student organization, and is what Jonah Rubin has cleverly explained to me as part of this larger ecosystem of Zionist repression. They're all working in partnership with each other. So I had the administration at my college, and I had the staff at Hillel actually surveilling my social media, taking screenshots, sending them on a group chat to Hillel undergraduate students, because the things I was posting were so harmful to the students that we have these administrators who are giving them to students and encouraging them to weaponize Title VI, engage lawfare in all of these ways. And, I think the thing that I really want to stress with this is that, my story ends with my termination and several appeals. But I think for all of us, we are being used as an example to create a chilling effect within a larger landscape. The Zionists don't have to come for all of us. They come for some of us. They isolate us. They try to make it seem as though there's something exceptional happening, and it creates this chilling effect. So I think the thing that I want to say about my story is there's nothing unique about it. There's nothing special about the tactics, about, they all have their own specificities, but it's all sort of part of the same playbook that they've been perfecting for decades and decades and decades, or I guess only a few decades, but still.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for kicking us off right there. And before we go to Michel, I just sort of reiterate that they need individuals for this to land on, but part of what I think all of us share is constantly saying this is not an individualized process. This is a structural process, and that we have to keep our eyes on it. I think that's also the parallel that we're making to this larger sort of geopolitical mess that Zionism and U.S. imperialism is a part of, because part of it is this psychic inversion that happens where they're the ones who are under attack. They're the ones who are just defending themselves. They're the ones who live in a bad neighborhood, right? When they're a settler colony that sort of built themselves up in a space, they're the intruders, not the other way around. But this is the shared structure and logic that we see across our cases. I had a similar thing happen, Maura, as you and I talked about, where after the fact, where when my case was settled through the Department of Education, and of course, no proof of retaliation or being anti-Semitic to students came to light, surprise, everything we had said all along. One of the things that did come to light was that university administrators had gone around and asked Hillel also about whether or not students had, quote unquote, seen my tweets, which had become suddenly, the tweets had become what was important. And those students were saying, no, we hadn't. So it's sort of also soliciting, right, responses, creating that. I think this is part of what you're saying about the long project of this. And maybe this is something we can get into afterwards, but the creation of this long-term project is also one in which Zionists are invested in this grassroots look, that this is all grassroots, that this is organic. It comes from students who are truly harmed versus having these large groups, right, that have been working for decades to intervene on campuses and sort of make sure that there are pressures where Palestine is not represented. And by the way, this is not a conspiracy theory. The Zionist state literally says this. We spend billions of dollars doing this, particularly on US campuses. So we're going to get into all of that. Michel, do you want to introduce yourself and locate?
Yes, of course. And thank you, Maura, for bringing up this issue of Hillel, because I think once we start looking at the way Hillel functions across campuses, then we get to see exactly what you were saying, Lara, that we have to really understand how the structure meets the individuals and create this impression, this illusion of grassroots movement. So in my particular case, as a linguist, I was able to see from my own perspective as a faculty at MIT linguistics, when I was part of that faculty at MIT, how those forces converge to enforce repression. First, I had the pushback from my faculty colleagues, and again, as a linguist, I was astounded that when I proposed my seminar exactly on December 5th, 2023, and I did that right after I heard in Congress the ways in which language was being manipulated to silence Palestine, including doing violence to meanings of words like intifada, equating intifada to a call for the genocide of the Jews, and also doing violence to core notions in linguistics like what meaning means, because Stephanie claimed that the meaning of the word intifada is calling for genocide of the Jews. So there were violences at various levels, both in terms of history, in terms of linguistics, but also in terms of the theory of linguistics. So I would have expected that my colleague linguists, both at MIT and even at the level of the Society of Linguists of the US, to rejoice, to say, well, here we have a chance to make a difference, to show that our field can contribute to justice at a global level. And three days after I proposed this seminar, I was shocked that my colleague, who's a semanticist of all things, was upset about my use of terms like colonial, resistance, genocide, apartheid, even comparing the use of the term Amalek of Netanyahu against Palestinians with the use of terms like vermin by Hitler against the Jews. And I thought that it was a comparison that was linguistically valid, given the history of genocides. So at one level, there was this repression from faculty colleagues against teaching about Palestine. And actually, as it turns out, just today, there's a new article that just came out in Curriculum Inquiry. And the theme of that article is teaching Palestine. And actually, I have to put it up actually because it's so, there's such poetry in that this article came out just today, March 1st. The title is Teaching Palestine, Praxis of Transgression and Possibility. It's by Zina Zakaria, Maria Ansopoulos, Rusbeh Shirazi, Hakim Mohandas, Amani Williams, Brooke Harris, and Monisha Bajaj. And they go about the history of repression of teaching about Palestine. So this is at the level of faculty administration. And then at the quote unquote grassroots level, looking at what happened to me at MIT, when my course was rejected, I managed to offer it as a so-called people seminar. It was a non-course, no credits, a speaker series. And one of my guest speakers was, actually I had two brilliant guest speakers among many, but there was Nurit Pledilanan, Israeli Jewish scholar, looking at textbooks in Israel and how they socialize children into the hatred of Palestinians. And I had a PhD student, Holly Jackson, her thesis at Columbia, her master's thesis that she did with actually the father of Mahmoud Khalil, of Mamdani, of Zoran Mamdani, Mahmoud Mamdani. So her thesis looked at how Hillel and other organizations that pretend to be grassroots Jewish organizations, how they orchestrate with Israel to repress Palestinians. So those were two extremely important lectures in my series. And then the next, maybe 2 days after, the president of Grad Hillel came at me on Twitter in a public forum, accusing me, now listen to this, of extremely dangerous rhetoric. Extremely dangerous rhetoric for reporting on scholarly work. These were work by scholars. One was a thesis at Columbia. The other one is an Israeli Jewish scholar who's published many books, many articles about the use of education as what she calls mind infection, right? And her work, actually, I find her work, Lara, to be quite complementary with your own work, because what she does, she looks at the ways in which the minds of children in Israel are being infected by these rhetorics that make Palestinians disposable entities, unbelievable entities, right? So after I I had this because I was attacked by the president of Grad Hillel about my course, about scholarly work that then became dangerous rhetoric. And that tweet created a whole thread of attacks against me, including death threats, insults, racist threats, so much that Cambridge police had to increase surveillance against my home to protect my family against crazies wanting to do harm to me and my family. And then it's the same Grad president who called me in court as being anti-Semitic, as harassing him. So it's a perfect case of what you've called, Lara, mere accusations for reality bending, right? So thanks to your work, I was able to make sense of these patterns of reality bending. So I'm so grateful to be now talking to you in person.
Thank you so much. Yes, I mean, this was I think that reality bending piece is one thing, you know, Stephen and I co-wrote this book, Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, and that was a central piece of it because we were trying to make sense of the ways in which people who ascribe to these ideologies, Zionism being the one we're talking about right now, have to engage in perpetual reality bending to be able to remain coherent in that process. So none of this surprises me. Everything breaks on Palestine, right? Everything we are taught in the academy to look at and think about and say, yes, critical thinking and all this. Now, those of us who are politically engaged knew this was a myth all along, right? We understand that, especially now, especially over, you know, past decades, that the university is a neoliberal profit-making machine. And this idea of critical thinking is you know, it is a myth, if nothing else. Like, I wish our universities were a safe haven to Marxists and radical thinkers, like it's always said. Unfortunately, folks, I hate to be the bearer of bad news. It's not the case at all. But I think there's something really important about how everything breaks open on Palestine. And this is where I wonder if either of you have something you can add to this, particularly emanating from your own experiences. Like, what are the mechanics that you experience, the processes, the things that broke, you know, procedure, like all the stuff that can only happen when we are engaged in the work for the liberation of Palestine. Everything, we've heard about it as a Palestine exception, but I think there are also other scholars who talk about like the Zionist exception, because it's really the mobilization of Zionism against this. Like, any mention of Palestine ends up setting off this entire series of events. But I'm wondering if you can just sort of let folks know what it looked like on your end. What are the things that happened? How did Palestine break shit when it came to your cases?
Yeah, I can start this off by just reflecting on one of these contradictions that I think that the question is often asked, like, is Israel controlling the United States, or is the United States controlling Israel? And I think that that's a more complicated question that, depends on what direction you're looking at. But, like a lot of people, I had one student who filed a complaint against me, I think on October 12th, 2023. And I can talk more about, why that's, like, what the material of the class was. Spoiler, I was talking about the resistance and actually contextualizing things. And the student who filed the complaint against me of anti-Semitism, which, I don't want to, center my experience as a Jewish person, but, I was actually fired for anti-Semitism. The student who filed the complaint had taken a seminar the semester before, so the spring of 2023, about settler colonialism in the United States and the experience of indigeneity and white supremacy in North America. And that student excelled at that class as an American, as a white Jewish American who was reading critical indigenous theory, case studies, archaeology, et cetera, never a issue at all, never a complaint, never a feeling of victimhood, as a person who, for all intents and purposes, was being positioned as a white settler in on Turtle Island, as he should have been, but able to engage in the material in like what I heard. I didn't teach the class, but what I heard from that professor in like a thoughtful, engaged kind of way. And yet that ability to think as an anthropology major of, case studies and how theory, travels and how we can see connections, it completely broke down. I was able to teach a class on Kashmir and talk about Hindutva, but to talk about Palestine collapsed everything that student had actually been able to learn in a sort of like grounded, qualitative, empirical kind of way, to the point in which merely saying the word Palestine felt like violence to him. And I think that this is so, I think that this reveals many, many things, but I think, to what extent have we created the conditions in the United States where you can actually be critical of structures of power in particular frameworks? I mean, we know that, we're watching under the Trump administration as all of these programs that have tried to like expand the bubble of higher ed are colliding and collapsing. But, how are certain forms of critique and engagement in North America or in Australia or in, wherever, they don't exist in the same way in the Zionist colony in Palestine, in the context of Palestine. And so I think that this really was this sort of moment for me in which, as an anthropology professor who believed that like ethnography and case studies and, theory, that like there was room to carefully pry open the world for students who needed help rethinking the world that they had been given. That the space of Palestine and the Zionist project is actually so fragile that to even touch it would collapse it in a way that doesn't work in North America, in the way that doesn't work in so-called Australia. And so, I don't think I have an answer yet, but just sort of seeing the way that the same student can think really critically about one settler colonial context and one genocidal context and not another has been something that I've been, I understand it and I also don't understand it.
And this is a student, just to be clear, this is a student that lives in the United States. So the identification is that, I mean, that's a big part of it.
Although I have it on rumor, but not good authority, that student is now in occupied Palestine, that student is no longer in the United States. So, what does that say about, the past few years?
Yeah. But it's, that again, listening to Maura speak about experience shows us the beauty of community and the power in networks, because what Maura described with a student and how the very mention of Palestine broke down the capacity to understand, to build knowledge, is such a parallel to what I experienced with my linguistic colleagues. Because actually, so the same department head who violently opposed my interpretation of key terms having to do, say, with Zionism, with genocide, with resistance, with colonialism, then he created a review committee. For my first time in 2018 at MIT Linguistics, there was an ad hoc committee put together to review my course proposal. And I was stunned to read as one argument for rejecting the course, and this was an elective course, the special topics, and special topics are defined as courses that are supposed to create knowledge in areas not covered by the regular curriculum. So the very definition of special topics courses are to create knowledge. And I was told that I lack expertise to teach about Palestine and Israel, even though my point was to teach about language and power in that context. And for the past two decades, plus more than 2 decades, that was my work, looking at language and power in the context of Haiti, the Caribbean, Black America, Africa, etc.
That's why, brother. That's why, because you were actually teaching about power.
Exactly. But then listen to this. In one of the letters I got from that so-called review committee, I was told it's okay for you to teach about language and linguistics for decolonization and liberation in Haiti, but don't talk about it because it's in Palestine. So basically, I'm qualified to analyze the language of power for Haiti, but please don't touch Palestine and Israel because you don't even speak Arabic, which coming from coming from linguists, to me it's such a laughable pretext, because if you take Noam Chomsky built his career as probably the best known linguist. He's written about Swedish, about Faroese, about Icelandic. He doesn't speak those languages. So no one would say that Chomsky cannot study those languages, even though he doesn't speak them, but he can study them. So the same is true for me. I don't speak Arabic, but as a linguist who's done so much work on language and power, I have complete right to actually investigate the use of language and power in Palestine and Israel. And that's the way you create expertise. That's the way you create knowledge. And in fact, in my seminar, I had as guest speakers faculty, well-known faculty from Israel and Palestine, who could actually complete what I didn't have as background. But it's to just show you, Maura, that scenario that you describe about your students, it's basically, again, it's only through community, through networking, that we can discover these patterns. And language plays such a key role in that, because you asked, Lara, what mechanisms have we faced in this repression? And the key mechanism is the use of the very word Zionism and the power the Zionists give it in being conflated with Judaism. And the part that I find the most worrisome is that it even silences our so-called allies. For example, let's take the Hillel case, right? For the past couple of years now, it's become so obvious in MIT how Hillel has become basically a branch of Israel on campus. And this is no secret, because actually, if you read Haaretz, there was an article about a meeting at the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, where Hillel was presented as a success story for repressing Palestinian voices, for repressing Palestine solidarity. And MIT was cited as one of the most successful cases because they managed to change the orientation of the administration when it comes to disciplining students, right? Yet, when I proposed to my allies at MIT that we should bring this up in the faculty meeting to show that students are being disciplined very unfairly, not because of what they do, but because of outside pressure against our own students who are speaking truth to power, who are being morally upright. And I was told by an ally, no, Michel, you cannot do that. You cannot mention Hillel at the faculty meeting. I said, but why not? This is exactly part of the structure that we have to undo. We have to undo this conflict of interest where we have Hillel executive, we have the VP of Hillel, who for a long time was the dean of student life. He was the one deciding who to discipline. And he was a Hillel vice president, which is the most flagrant conflict of interest when it comes to discipline of students who are defending Palestinian humanity. And I was told you cannot do that because that could make everyone accuse you of being anti-Semitic, which means that even our allies are committing self-censorship because of this fear of being called anti-Semitic for actually protesting an agent of Israel on campus, which is repressing our students, which is actually getting students expelled even. You see? So this is one of the probably most brutal mechanisms silencing both students and faculty who should know better. We should be much more forceful in defending our students, you see?
Yeah, and they rely on that, right? They rely on sort of censorship, on self-disciplining, on fear. I think Maura was saying this earlier about creating a chilling effect. On one level, that's why they need individuals. They need to make cases out of us. They need to make it look like it's an individual. Maura, you brought up Sami Narian and Stephen Salaita, which are probably some of the most known cases. And that's how it gets mobilized. But this is the thing, is like, at this point, that can't be enough. And I refuse to call these people allies anymore. I'm just like, what is it that you are actually investing in when we see the mechanics happen? I refuse to believe that anybody on campuses right now don't know the pressures upon us and who from the outside are creating those pressures, and how administrators, by the way, cave immediately because they're invested in a product, nothing more, nothing less. Our students are showing us the way. But I think that's part of it, is like, if we can look across our cases, is not only do external forces come in and try to dictate and reconfigure what the university looks like, which they've been trying to do for decades. And Palestine is the entry point, right? And everything else comes after that. So we see administrators doing that. We see donors, like we were saying. We see organizations like Hillel. And then we see, quote unquote, liberal colleagues who also join in making targets out of us. Because the bottom line is, if you are not standing up and unifying with your fellow faculty who are getting railroaded like this, there is actually no two sides. You're either creating a target, because when you don't side with us, you actually put a larger target on our back.
Absolutely.
Right. And that was my experience. I had one person who is near and dear to me, Helen, who is a ride or die, stood by me through it all. And by the way, maybe this is our experience too. It's always the people with the least power that are willing to step the fuck up.
Absolutely.
Full professors, associate, and the students, but like adjunct faculty, assistant professors, over and over and over and over again, I see that they're the people who are willing to step up, because so it's the people with the most to lose that see this, that track this. But I do think that that's important too, is who's closing ranks with power, right? Under the crush of Zionist pressure that is not grassroots in any way. Maura, did you want to say something?
Yeah, on a personal, micro level, I think it's really important that we have to, I just saw a comment about how do we admit that it's systematic. We all have our stories of were you alienated? Did you have support? What did that look like in terms of community on your campus? And obviously it depends on campus to campus and individual to individual, but I can count on one hand the number of people that were in contact with me through my investigation and who I'm still in contact with now. And, I think the danger is that folks do not want, because, whether or not you're a US citizen or not, we are here in the US in the center of this monstrous capitalist empire in which we have this structure of fantasy success that, I think folks in academia are trying to strive towards. The idea that if you work hard enough and keep your head down, you're actually going to get the thing that most of us are never going to get. And, on my former campus, this year, the Board of Trustees just sort of paused the tenure decision. Folks are not hearing about their tenure decision in the time that they were supposed to, and there's no accountability. And I've heard rumors that faculty are going to start to be laid off at the end of the semester. And I think that there's a version of this in which that has nothing to do with me or us, and there's another version of this in which it has everything to do with me and us. What do we allow to happen? And I think it's really, interesting I've had to, I'm 46 now, and I was born in the United States. I've had to unlearn a lot of things over my life, and I'm still doing it, and I'm not there yet. But I do think that when we're institutionalized in the way that we are institutionalized in order to get through graduate school and get these jobs, I think that there's the idea that if we just behave in a certain kind of way and we work in a particular kind of way, we're going to get the thing. And somehow the thing becomes the institution, the right job, the right position, the right department, tenure, etc. And what does it mean to actually think we're here, I hope, those of us in the room are here for the work, but in a larger ecosystem in which you can research whatever you want, you can teach whatever you want, you can study whatever you want, but is the goal success in the institution, or is the goal making your work means something in the world. And I think there's a real breakdown in this question. And I think we're seeing that play out to the point in which, I don't think that there will ever be large scale revolution in the United States because of the way that it's structured. But when is there going to be large scale revolution on our campuses? Like, aside from the student intifada, like when is that actually going to happen? Because who is actually benefiting from the system? It's our administrators who are getting raises. It's people from Hillel who are getting into the administration, but it's certainly not faculty, 70% of whom are contingent.
Michelle, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I was thinking about what the two of you were saying about siding with power, and in my experience, what I found to be the most discouraging, but at the same time, I think it's also, as a linguist and as someone who loves history, I'm trying to use it as a learning moment, not just for me, but for all of academia. Is the notion of what does academic freedom means? It's something that Maura has written a lot about, and connecting to the issue that you just described, Maura. How do we define success? And there's a late colleague now who I really admire a lot. His name is Ken Hale, and he did lots of work with indigenous communities in the Americas, in Australia, and he had this definition of success that's very similar to what Maura said, which is that as a linguist, our success must be measured in the ways that we improve the quality of the lives of the people who speak those languages that we study. It's not a matter of describing language X, Y, and Z in such a precise and scientific way, but for him, the measure of success is how can you improve the lives of these people whose languages you study, that you work on. And that definition has always marked me. And I've always used it as a guide to my own work. Again, going back decades, the work I do in Haiti, I started with being very theoretical, looking at the structure of the language, how it arose out of contact between African languages and French. And I've done the same for other Creole languages, comparing Haitian Creole to Irish, etc. But what I found to be the most fulfilling is when my work gets to have an application to help improve the lives of Creole speakers in Haiti, in Jamaica, in Hawaii, and elsewhere. And then when I think of the ways that academicians have tried to define academic freedom, to restrict it. For example, one case that I found to be most galling is when the MIT chapter of AAUP, the way that it sided with the administration against me is to claim that the administration also has academic freedom, meaning they have collective academic freedom. And that kind of freedom takes priority over my own as an individual faculty, because they too can decide what's worth teaching. And therefore, their choice can overweigh my own choice of wanting to teach about Palestine. And that argument actually is a recipe to destroy what academic freedom means. Because if you look at, for example, the history of the McCarthy era, that's exactly what was used back then to claim that universities can decide that they want to be anti-communist. Therefore, if they decide that they don't want the students to be taught communism, they don't want the students to be indoctrinated, they have the right to kick out red faculty, right? But in this case, luckily, there are scholars like John Scott at AAUP or Ellen Schrecker, who's done a beautiful history of the McCarthy era, who show precisely that that's not what academic freedom means. Because academic freedom, in my case, for example, to make it concrete, as a faculty, I have the right to want to expand my research into Palestine based on what I've learned about language and power, say, in Haiti. That's my right. And the department should not repress that, especially not when it's clear that I'm being repressed for political reasons, not for any intellectual reasons. And it's clear that I was even told that given the climate these days politically, it would be dangerous to teach about Palestine. I was told that. I was even told, very recently, this is a bit of a long story, but let me try to make it brief. After my course was rejected and I offered this people's seminar, I managed to get MIT OpenCourseware to record almost every single session. And those were, brilliant sessions, from well-known linguists, extremely well-known linguists, extremely well-known Israeli scholars and Palestinian scholars. And OpenCourseware now has these videos. And guess what? They won't publish them. And when I ask, why is it that those videos are not being published, I've been told, that it's an issue of protecting MIT against reprisal from Washington. You see? So this is where we are, where notions like academic freedom, notions like, so OpenCourseware's motto is, guess what? Unlocking knowledge. You see, you have a motto like unlocking knowledge, you have a motto like, mind and heart for a better world, who are now being totally bent because of Palestine,
Yes.
So
exactly. That's what I was thinking, is that you're being repressed for political reasons, you're being targeted for political reasons. All three of us were that, but it's not just any political reasons, it's specifically Palestine. And I think we cannot understate this or overstate this enough, right? We need to keep highlighting that. And I think this is, again, what both of you are saying, and how long-term of a project this has been. So when Charlie Kirk got assassinated, I got a call from some journalist who found my name on Turning Point USA and wanted to have like a pre-conversation with me or something about that. And one of the things I sort of broke down, and this, we all know this, most journalists who are sort of taking this up have no idea what they're talking about, have just kind of fallen into this, just now starting to figure it out. And it was because of Charlie Kirk that they got into this to begin with. They're like, we're doing an investigation about Turning Point. And did you know that there are all these lists that blacklist professors? And I'm like, oh yes, I did know, actually. Here are all the lists that my name are on. Turning Point USA is one of them. But one of the things that I continuously kept saying, and I don't know what ended up happening with this investigative story, which says everything we need to say, is that this has been a long-term project. And disproportionately, when you look at these websites, Canary Mission is its own thing because it's specific to Palestine. But Turning Point USA, beforehand, it was Campus Watch, whatever the ones over the series, or David Horowitz's horrible, freedom, I don't know what the fuck he called it. I kept saying overwhelmingly, disproportionately, they are academics and professors who speak about the liberation of Palestine. And sometimes in very oblique way. Like, there's some people who will say to me, like, I don't know why I'm even on this page. You might just say something about Palestine, or in your private life, whatever that is in terms of the separation between the two, actually sign a letter or do. And some of it is so low bar, like just signing a letter in support of one of our colleagues ends up having you on these lists. But we can't ignore the data about what are the politics that actually break this down. And it is Palestine where these psychic inversions happen. It is Palestine that ends up making what was once coherent turn itself inside out, right? And distort itself entirely. This is also the parallel we're seeing on a quote unquote international level, that every single myth we have been sold and it has been pushed down our throats about liberal humanism, about fairness, about law, international law, all these sorts of things breaks on Palestine. Now, one of the things that I'm hearing from the both of you, whether Maura, it's through your student who just can't, they have a psychic collapse because of this. You're able to sort of take an indigeneity in the context of the settler colony of the United States, but not elsewhere. But also, Michel, on your case, the ghettoization of your expertise into one area, you can also see the ways in which these mechanics, Palestine being the entry point, but also tap into an infrastructure that's already present, an infrastructure of racism. It's fucking racist to be like, this is the only place you can only study Haiti. Right? It's fucking racist.
Super racist.
Completely. And the ways in which the university is already saturated by racism, by cis heteronormativity, by these structures of power. And then Palestine becomes the place that opens it all up. In my case, one of the things that started to happen, so, it was one student who later I found out had worked with Stand With Us, One of them was an intern with Stand With Us when she was in high school. I mean, none of this is grassroots. What started to happen was that the administration was saying to me, why don't we're going to have the deans come sit in your classroom as you teach? And I was just like, in what universe does a dean, not singularly, like plural deans, come sit in the classroom of a professor? The other thing they said is that they wanted to surveil my Blackboard. So it's like the journals that students write. And I kept just saying to them, I need you to look at what you are proposing. You are surveilling, and also the only Arab, by the way, faculty, your fix is to surveil me. This is not just about me, but this is a larger, again, the fucking up of a process. When you start surveilling professors sitting in their classrooms, deans, surveilling their blackboards, what do we have available? The most fucked up thing that I will share with you all, I'm not sure if I've ever said this publicly. I'm fine to do that. It is public knowledge. Is that one of the things they offered at the beginning was to create an entire separate classroom for Jewish students. And I had to write them back. I wrote them back and I said, let me get this straight. You have one student who's saying that they believe that my anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And your fix is to create a classroom where you take all Jewish students who haven't said anything, by the way, even, and you create a classroom by themselves. You don't think that's anti-Semitic? Like, I'm the one who had to be like, what the fuck are you doing? How are you, number one, recreating the Zionist entity? You're creating just a space by themselves for Jews as though they're so, alien that they have to have their own space. But this is the level of psychic breakdown that ends up happening. And we are tasked then with like reflecting back to these corrupt, utterly unhinged, clueless, out of touch administrators about what the actual impact is, what the look of it is. And this was, by the way, 5 months before Stand With Us filed this thing. Could you imagine what would have happened to the university if Stand With Us was like, and they created a classroom by itself? I mean, you can't make this shit up. You cannot make this shit up. Maura, I think you wanted to say something.
No, I mean, I was just gonna echo the like, they wanted you to create a Zionist state in your, like an apartheid Zionist entity in your educational space. I mean, it's completely bananas. It doesn't make any sense. And yet it falls totally within the logic of Zionism, to the T.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think UPenn get a letter, is it from the DOJ or from Congress? I'm not sure, but the letter asked that UPenn create a list of Jewish affiliates. And they said no, and they resisted that, but they were asked by the government or to produce such a list. So again, along the very same lines that you just described, Lara.
Yes.
I just want to jump in. This speaks to something Michel brought up, and just this like profoundly racist and fucked up way of, and we see this in, I think, all of our disciplines, where we focus in our research on case studies, and we use those to open up the world in our classrooms, and also comparative publications and whatever. I was trained as a scholar of urban India, but I mean, I don't just teach about urban India. In fact, I teach about stories from all over the world. And, Palestine is so particular. I just have never seen this in any other case in higher ed, and we see this in legacy media as well, where if you're thinking about who can report on Palestine, Israelis and Zionists with absolutely no credibility and no journalistic background and no integrity at all are reporting on the front page of newspapers and magazines, and Palestinians and other anti-Zionist voices are writing opinion pieces in the background. Like, that's always sort of the way these things are framed. And I just think so much, Michel, about what you were told in terms of your class, because with Palestine, it's a trap. There's no way around this. If you don't actually study the region, you can't say anything with any authority about the region. But if you study the region or are from the region, if you're Palestinian, you're too biased to say anything about, the region or the politics or whatever. And so within, our institutions that, are supposed to be invested in scholarship and, academic inquiry and research and all of these things, there's this I don't know if funnel is the right metaphor, where if you're talking about Palestine, there's a bind and, power has made it so that there's no way out of it. If you say the word Palestine, you are a terrorist, you are an anti-Semite, you are a this, that, and the other, you're not credible, you're too emotional, you're all, whatever, like we want, we see these folks with power throwing at, Palestinians, allies, anti-Zionist, etc., whoever. There's no way around it, because to actually study Palestine or tell stories about Palestine is to reveal the fact that, like, we can say what we want about the US or so-called Australia or whatever, but, Palestine was colonized at the end of colonization. Like, how do you justify an apartheid state that is by definition foundationally about apartheid, settler colonialism, genocide, ethnic cleansing? Like, there's nothing else to the so-called state of Israel but that. So to actually say anything is to say that. I mean, what are these Zionists going to do? They're going to completely lose their mind.
Yeah. I think there again we come back to, I find this is to be the core notion that Lara described so well. This psychic inversion, the psychic collapse, and this drive to isolate those case studies and to refuse to connect them, because one would think that if you know anything about the history of colonization, you would want your scholars, like in my case, my colleagues, to encourage this linking of Haiti with Palestine, because Haiti went through much of what Palestine has gone through going back to 1492. We knew about occupation, genocide, apartheid, and until now, we're still living with the legacies of these forces. So what better way to understand colonization and the results of it linguistically in terms of power hierarchies than to compare those case studies, you see? But then, of course, as you say so well, Maura, the administration, the Zionist entities, they don't want us to do that, because once you do that, you expose way too much. And language is, again, at the core of it. You see, I have talking about psychic collapse, I have to read for you a short paragraph that a colleague linguist wrote to me recently. The subject of the email is, "Are you pro-Hitler by any chance?" And they write, "Very disappointing to see that a quasi-colleague like yourself supports Hamas killing members of my race and ethnicity." Okay, and then she signs so-and-so, a fifth-generation Zionist. And the part that I find to be, that goes and support your point, Maura, right below signature, there is a native acknowledgement. They write, "I respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we work and learn, and pay respect to the First Nations peoples and the elders past, present, and future." And I couldn't, he said, wait, so you accuse me of being pro-Hitler because I'm talking about the humanity of Palestinians, and at the same time, you have a signature line that respectfully acknowledges the owners of the land. So how can you not put those two things together? You see? But obviously the psychic collapse is so severe that they don't see the connection. So on the one hand, respecting the knowledge and the ownership of the land by the native people, and on the other hand, refusing the Palestinians to are native to Palestine. You see, so that's a linguist.
Yes, well, yeah. And that's the thing is, like, contradictions can exist under ideology, right? And I think that would be, but it's also one of the ways in which we can call into question these performative gestures of land acknowledgements without committing to land back, without being, extending it across the board. But this also goes into the case of Haiti. Michel, it's not a surprise to me, because if you were to connect Haiti with Palestine, there's a lot we can fucking learn about what our Haitian comrades have taught us about revolution, about sort of reclaiming land, about continued struggle, the last thing that folks would want is to have this connection be made. I do think there's an attack on that, right? If we talk about knowledge production and all these sorts of things, the reason I think why things collapse on Palestine is because of anti-Palestinian and anti-Arab racism and the specificity of a supremacy that comes with a Zionist state. That is the essence, as Maura was just saying, about what the construction of the Zionist state is. It's a supremacist ethno-nationalist project, right? So you can't actually include recognition of any sense of Palestinianism because it sort of disrupts that. It disrupts the process of that. But I think this is the other side, the other side of it is that disrupting the linking up of Palestine with other struggles that have taught us so much and that people identify with also becomes extremely dangerous to an ideology that relies on making itself very exclusive. And this is, I think, goes back to where we started more when you were just like, there is nothing special about this case because the logic of repression repeats itself. That the moment that we, tie up all these struggles, it also is a fabric that people can tap into. And I think this is what we're seeing. Like, even with the aggressions on Iran right now, the folks are not taking shit anymore. They're just like, there's an entire, we've seen sort of the Epstein class or the Epstein regime. We understand who sort of makes decisions on a global scale for the larger world, the handful of fucking capitalists that are necro-capitalists that care nothing about anything except plundering the earth, which extends to human beings. And folks are just like, no, I see the connections, but there's nothing more dangerous to power than folks kind of being like, okay, I get this. I get what's happening. I can trace this. This is a portable logic. Which might be also our interventions, again, even not as individuals, but one of the things that I respect and admire so much about the both of you is your unbending clarity, your unwillingness to bend away from precisely what you see to be true, your resistance and refusal to succumb to the psychic collapse, right? That is the intention. The intention is to have us collapse in the face of this. And go back on our word. I mean, speaking of emails, the number of emails I got from rando people, but also so-called colleagues being like, why don't you just apologize? If you just apologized, and I'm just like, what the fuck do you want me to apologize for? Right? So it's like an admission of guilt without any guilt, but that would somehow make them feel better. Maura, I think you were.
No, I mean, I'm just like thinking along with you. And I think, to echo you, I mean, I think this is what I found so fortifying about the communities that have emerged in, there's no silver lining to genocide. There's no silver lining to like the violence that we have seen. But I do think that the past few years has really clarified where people stand politically in a way that maybe some of us could like tilt our head and wink and see alliances with people who had politics that were fundamentally opposed to us, at least in terms of Palestine. And I think, Iran is also revealing these things. I mean, the way that the United States has sort of forged its identity over my entire lifetime in like looking for a new specter, which has been Islam, it has been, Iran, it has been Palestinians and Arabs, etc. I was born in 1979. So, and I think that, I don't know how the next few years are going to play out, but on a larger scale, I take so much comfort in knowing that our students have seen exactly what is happening. I mean, this is why, to quote Omar Zaza, there's this, digital settler colonialism that's happening, the takeover of TikTok, the erasure of videos, et cetera, the destruction of the student intifada. Like, power is doing all of these things to convince young people that they have not seen what they have actually seen. They're going after our archives, they're going after our classes, they're going after our scholarship, and it's not gonna work. Like, we have seen what we have seen, and even if people are still scrambling to understand what it means in terms of their own lives. It's very hard to think outside of capitalism in the United States. I imagine North America and Europe similarly. It's very hard to think outside of empire. It's very hard to think outside of white supremacy if you've been instilled in it. Zionism, you could say the same thing, but people are seeing exactly what is happening, while we also see that our leaders are like literal cannibal pedophile monsters. And when you see who's actually in control of your schools, of your government, et cetera, and then you're supposed to like see the enemy as a resistance fighter on the other side of the world who's literally doing everything they possibly can to protect their family and their people and their land. It's not working.
Yeah, this is maybe goes into what we were talking about just a little bit earlier about the necessity of being engaged. Like if our job is scholars, which we are reared in the academy, and I'm not someone who doesn't think. Let me think about how I want to say this. I do not believe our liberation is going to happen on campuses. Right? That can't. However, I believe that places are contested space. I also don't believe that the places of higher education, as we have seen from our students, are worthless. We also see in history, the history of fascism, who they go after. Students and leftist faculty get assassinated, get killed. So we know there's a place for that, primarily because it's a place of knowledge production, disruption, where students can, somebody had said, get an education in real time, get exposed to certain ideas, link up with others, organize, understand that their world is bigger than just the campus, all these sorts of things, right? And get access to histories that are a lot, that can become alive because you're connecting it to larger issues. But for me, again, and this is borrowing from Comrade Bassel El-Ara's revolutionary and Palestinian martyr, right, who talked about the need for academics and intellectuals to be engaged. Otherwise, you have no use. Like there's no use if you are not a politically engaged person. If you're not, you're just one of those academics that we should be pushing it, or you're the academic that writes Michel an email and thinks they're doing something great, or the academics, in your case, Maura, who don't reach out to you, despite the fact that if something like this happens on their campus, what's to say it's not going to happen to them? Even from a completely narcissistic and self, sort of aggrandizing way, they don't do any of that. But maybe this is a good way for us to think, and I'd love to hear from you all. How do we remain in antagonism to the academy? Especially if we continue to exist within that, what are ways we remain in antagonism towards it? And what does this mean for our larger movements? Like, what's the place for this type of knowledge production? Maura, you and I are engaged with the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism. It is about sort of contesting that space, thinking more critically about things, creating a sort of a knowledge base and field that goes side by side with other ones that is quote unquote legitimate, whatever that means. But any thoughts for you all about like, how do we channel this and mobilize this to remain as engaged scholars and thinkers and knowledge producers?
I can try to take a stab at that. I mean, I think it's one of the most important questions.
It's a very small question for you.
It's a very small question. Yeah. No really big stakes. I mean, I think that this obviously lands differently for everyone, depending on how they're positioned. But I mean, I've been saying this over and over and over again for a few years now, and it means something different to me every time I say it, to be honest. But we have to be ready to lose things. We have to be ready to lose our jobs, the protection of our institution if we think we have it, the connection we have to our colleagues, our book contracts, our tenure, if we are actually invested in long-term collective liberation. We can't hold on to the fantasy of capitalism, the fantasy of like the middle class professorial life that we aspire to. And also, that's a really hard, complicated, messy. I mean, I lost my job, I lost my home, I lost my healthcare. I have not been able to find another job. You know, these are real material things, but at the same time, for me, there's no version of reality in which I would ever be able to live with myself if I kept my head down and didn't say and write and do the things because that's the only reason that I actually wanted this job in the first place. So I think it's about like remembering what we're actually all working towards, which I think like not being able to pay our rent or our mortgage, struggling with, you know, our healthcare, like all of the things that make life so difficult in the United States. I'm in France right now, and I tried to explain American health insurance to someone the other day, and she was like, it didn't make sense. And at the end she was like, but then it's free. And I was like, oh no, then you have a copay. Like living in the United States doesn't make any sense. It's, you know, it's a completely bananas way of being. And also I think if we're trying to hold on to the life that maybe we were promised, the life that we believed we could aspire to, then we're going to make concessions over and over and over and over and over again until we cannot think beyond the limits of the structures that we find ourselves in. And I think that I think this looks different for everyone, but we have to lose things if we want to be part of a larger movement that is invested in collective liberation, because we're not going to free ourselves within capitalism. We're not going to free ourselves within the, like, you know, reform of American empire. You know, the Democrats are not going to save us, our administrators are not going to save us, and our colleagues are not going to save us. And so I think just remembering that we need to be finding our community. We can't do this on our own. We become disposable if we're doing this on our own. We find our people. They may or may not be at our institutions. They may or may not be in academia, but we have to build support networks so that people can take risks and not lose everything. And that, I think, requires imagination and community care that's actually anti-American. So I think we just all have to be like better at being anti-American, because within this system, we are just going to be on the same violent hamster wheel over and over again.
Here. Thank you so much for that. And I think, you know, being anti-American means also freeing up your imagination about what could emerge. And I think that I find what you're saying so moving. I think us three share this vision and this commitment, and to recognize that when you are fighting a revolutionary fight, when you have a cause bigger than yourself, risk is always involved, and so is loss, right? I think militants understand this, and I think this is the thing that people can't sort of wrap their minds around. Back to sort of connecting Haiti and Palestine and every other peoples of the world that fight for their liberation, the calculus that comes when you're up against power and willing to lose everything, including your life, for that, right? That's the cause that's bigger. I think one of the things that I always said about my case is that Zionists miscalculated, and they thought this was just like a side gig for me, right? And it's sort of like, this is not a side gig. This is connected to everything that I hold dear and am committed to in the world, to bring into being a world in which those sacrifices and wagers don't have to be made. Like that you would not have to make the choice between, do I keep my health care in general, by the way, even outside of losing your job? Like people are making those concessions and those impossible choices all the time. Do I keep my health care, or do I, you know, live feeling like I don't have integrity? Those are impossible choices, and that come from violent systems and conditions all the time. But I think this is part of what I love what you're saying, is that it means you are committed. That is what being committed to liberation means, and making that calculus all the time. And we can see big examples of this, like liberation fighters in Palestine every single day. It's not like they don't know that they could lose their literal lives, right? Or those of us, again, on the spectrum of what does it mean to constantly be in alignment with your politics, irrespective of the pressures for us to cave, concede, or compromise. And in the context of Palestine, this is the story of Palestine, the constant negotiations and compromises that are forced upon people. And in the realm of all of this, I just want to say, and I want to hear from you, Michel, is that even when we make this, like, we're still looked at as though we're the aggressors. After we've lost all these sorts of things, the story still is that we are the ones that are aggressing, that we're the ones, and no amount of suffering is enough. Like the amount of people that I hear, and currently what's happening, and for me, is that unless you fully submit, it's never enough. Like I always was struck by, it wasn't enough to get pushed out of a job. It wasn't enough to lose your job, Maura. It wasn't enough to get punished, Michel. It's not enough that they want you to become a Zionist. And anything short of that is not enough.
Or they want you to die, because that, yes, and that's how they understand
that's the
Palestine.
Other side.
Like the idea is like absolute destruction.
I don't think any Zionists actually like hope for us to become I actually think that they want us to die,
because that is the framework, the violent.
If you don't fully
reverse.
Convert, yes, they will kill you. You're right. Yeah, Michel, go ahead.
Well, one silver lining that I really benefit from these days is this community that we're in right now, and I feel that no matter what happens at MIT, what I've gained through these punishments, actually going back to mere accusation, I was called disruptive. In fact, the letter from my dean, which I like to reread, because I was called disruptive, and the reasons why is because I protested the rejection of my seminar. I protested in email and in writing essays in Le Monde Diplomatique and in the students' newspaper. That was ground for me being disruptive. And interestingly, the dean even cited MIT's rules on time, place, and manner constraint on protest, which are meant for physical protest. And all of a sudden, those constraints applied to my email and to my essays. And that is that until I stop being disruptive, I will be kept out of my department. So exactly. So the point here is not so much for me to become a Zionist, but at least I need to shut up. And until I shut up, I will not be part of my department of 28 years before I was kicked out of it.
Stay in your place.
Stay in my lane. And my lane is to just talk about Haiti. But what I find to be really something extraordinary coming from Mondoweiss is the fact that, I was hired at MIT, and my work has always been about language and liberation. This is part of my, I can even call it now, my DNA as a researcher, as a professor. And most of my courses explicitly refer to the importance of language for liberation. And I'm doing 2 classes this semester, and the graduate classes. One is called Black Matters, which I co-teach with 2 fabulous colleagues, and the other one is on Creole languages in the Caribbean. And in both these courses, the topic of Palestine always comes in the discussion, because you cannot talk about liberation if you don't talk about what's happening right now as the extreme case of colonization. And I kept asking, how could they even consider that I would not teach about these topics? And the students want it, and this is where, talking about the future, this is what gives me hope, is that the students get it. The students get it so deeply, you see? And here I have to cite that one student, going back to what you were saying earlier, Lara, whether our work should be confined or can be confined to the academia. And the students understand that very well. In fact, the one student who was expelled last year from MIT, and he was expelled because of a complaint from the president of Grad Hillel and the president of MIT's Israel Alliance. He wrote an essay called On Pacifism. It's now I quote this essay in most what I write now, because it's almost like it's very much like à la Frantz Fanon. And he published it in this magazine. It's a student magazine called Written Revolution. And he makes this argument: should pacifism be imposed on people who are oppressed? Should pacifism be the only tool that they can use in trying to make social change for their liberation? And he looks at a series of cases where pacifism was never enough as a strategy, that sometimes you had to engage into violent protests. right? Which for me as a Haitian, I totally understand, because there is no way that Haiti could have ever become independent if Dessalines were to have remained pacifist and ask Napoleon, please, Napoleon, will you give us our freedom? No, that would have been impossible. So I get it. But when the Zionists at MIT read this essay, they complained that it made them feel that he was a terrorist. So on Twitter, on X, they called Palad a domestic terrorist for writing this essay. And 2 days after, the VP of Hillel, acting as a dean of student life, wrote to Palad a letter bringing him into the discipline process. And eventually, Palad was kicked out. But the point that Palad makes in this essay is that we cannot keep our movement within academia. We have to extend our solidarity with folks in the community. And for him, mutual aid is a very important tool to use towards liberation. You see, so, and when I read that essay, and which I quote now quite often, I feel that this is the future. The students understand it very deeply. They see what's at stake, and they are willing to pay the price. In this case, he was kicked out. He was expelled from MIT for writing an essay that made, so that gives me hope. That gives me hope.
Yeah. I posted it in the chat for folks, the link to the essay, but I think it what you're saying matches very much what Maura was saying about the risks that we're willing to take. And in many ways, I think all of us can agree that I'm not sure that we're calculating that sometimes is clear, right? Like, we know that speaking about Palestine is going to disrupt things because that's the formation and the infrastructure that we're in. But oftentimes, I don't think that we're sitting there thinking me doing this is going to end up in me losing my job, right? And I think that's the whole point, is to sort of say, yes, when you stand up for these things, when you are in alignment with your politics, when you refuse to bend, to go back to Fanon in a Fanonian way, is that nothing, unless it hits at the heart of colonialism, and I'm paraphrasing here, will actually disrupt the system. And so that is a marker for us. Like, the risks come because of us being unbending in the truth telling. And in this case, about so-called pacifism, we might think about it is that this goes back to the idea is that all of us are always positioned as violent because of the disruption to the machinery of capitalism, of empire, of Zionism. So, and I think that was Fanon's point, is like, not only is armed resistance going to have to be part of the issue because violence is what structures this entire condition to begin with. And if we don't think of it that way, we're disavowing what structures settler colonialism to begin with. And so it's a lie that we constantly tell ourselves that somehow we can free ourselves up without political violence. But it's also to bring it back and say that anything that power deems as disruptive will be viewed as violent. And it doesn't mean that you're like, I mean, the way that liberals think about violence is like property destruction or like hitting somebody. Like, I don't think any of us have done that. And yet we're still looked at as being singularly violent. In my case, sort of a sleeper cell that has this singular, and it's actually, I wish I were making this up, right? That has sort of singular power to destroy and destruct the entire field of psychoanalysis, and certainly Jewish students within it. So it tells us it's a confessional. It's a confessional of power, right? Yeah.
Talking about, I just want to make a small footnote to Robin Kelly's. This is very interesting interview that he did with George Yancey in Truth Out on the issue of violence when you live in a state that's being so violent against you. So it was all about ICE and recent violence against immigrants, and including also U.S. citizens. And when you read that, and when you understand the history of Black resistance, the issue of violence is, you cannot put it aside. You have to think deeply about it. So I just wanted to mention that essay. It's in Truth Out. It's by George Yancey interviewing Robert Kelly.
I just put it in the chat. Yeah, it's not enough to abolish ICE. We have to abolish the police. Yeah.
Exactly.
Maura, go ahead.
I'm thinking about this notion of like casting people as violent. And the thing that I find, whether we're thinking about ICE or we're thinking about, any US administration from the founding of the United States to the Zionist entity in all its iterations, any sort of imperial colonial, genocidal entity, like those are structures of destruction, and they are like profoundly violent. And so to see people, movements, communities, forces of resistance, forms of resistance that are actually like, without romanticizing anything, are actually like deeply rooted in love, in community, in connection, in care. Like they might have violent iterations, but the goal is actually something much bigger than any of these violent states or entities could imagine. And so, I think we need more imagination and creativity, but we're also up against these structures that have no imagination and no creativity. And in some ways that's to our benefit, because they keep doing, we've been saying this, they keep doing the same things over and over and over and again. But when you're resisting, whether, I don't want to say that being in the classroom or being like actually in, on the ground in Gaza is at all the same. They don't even exist in the same, like landscape at all, but they are sort of part of the larger ecosystem. Like it is actually about imagining, creating, like building, connecting. And that is so threatening to a destructive force, whether it be our administrations, in our institutions, in our country, or larger, that need to destroy everything that's like generative and imaginative, and could imagine and can like conceive of a world beyond what we are submitting to under the status quo.
Absolutely. It's part of the reason why I got obsessively involved in tracking psychic intrusions, right? It's like all the ways in which systems of power target the psyche, not as an after effect, but like as a primary tool meant to reconfigure the way we think about ourselves, each other, and most importantly, possibilities for our revolutionary futures. And the way, like, it's meant to derail us from our political commitments precisely for this reason. I think, October 7th, Tawafan al-Aqsa is a great example of this. What a contemporary example of a space and place that we were meant to think was already a foreclosed conclusion, right? The siege is already there. Nothing can be done. No one can come in and out. Materially, that was true, right? And yet folks created a possibility. And I think sometimes people look at it and go, okay, but then the genocide, it's like, no, it was actually the inversion of that. The slow death, the genocide was already happening. And folks committed to saying what can become possible in this. And I think it's fair to say that the rest of the world changed, right? Inconceivably changed and irreparably changed in the most important ways to start to open up these possibilities where it's not that they didn't exist in history, it's that they're animated in a different way, partially because of the type of world we live in right now, right? Where these stories are real time. They're not just sort of relegated in history in a far gone time. It's like right now what's happening, but it's also within a larger sequence of events, if we can look at, right? The pandemic, which is ongoing still, being a primary part of that. The George Floyd uprisings, Ferguson, the movement for Black Lives, No Dapple. Like, if you follow over and over and over again the uprisings globally that have happened, the farmers' movements in India, the ongoing sort of liberation struggles in Kashmir and the Western Sahara. We can keep going on and on and on and on. I think we now live in a moment in which all these things are starting to be very intentionally linked up. And to your point, Maura, opens up a possibility for us to be like, what does this mean when we connect solidarity struggles? One of the things that emerged from actually, I've long sort of been connected to comrades around the world with these struggles. I think when you have these politics, that's what you end up doing in different ways. But alongside the level of violence, I think that all of us have experienced, I think we can also agree that in the opening up of networks of solidarity and starting to know, I mean, this is how we met, like knowing each other and starting to be like, oh, this person is here, and that we defy the geographies, both literally and then also the insular nature of academia that says we just exist on our campuses alone. I do think that's also happening. And the student intifada is also a great example of an imagination that, and they still do it. It's like every time the administration comes down on them, they pop up somewhere else, doing something else, experimenting, finding ways to disrupt, remaining antagonism towards the university that's meant to protect them, you know. But maybe in our final, you know, and wrapping up, maybe you can, is there anything else you want to offer, anything else by way of this, you know, creating community, imagination? Where do we end up? Where should our focus be to keep the pulse going here?
I mean, I think, you know, we're sort of tying this all through the lens of liberation, and I think it feels so generative to be in, you know, a virtual room with people who I feel so much care for and feel so connected to and have learned so much, and I feel like buoyed by that. And also at the same time, like, I'm going to click out of this and I'm going to go back to doom scrolling and trying to like get my head around the like last 24 hours and everything that is sort of has been exploding over the past few months and the past few years, and it's all sort of compiling. And I think, you know, the thing that I just keep reminding myself and everyone I'm in conversation with is that we are involved in a global movement against imperialism. We are like fighting for collective liberation. Anything that the US or the Zionist entity wants, agrees, supports is the definition of evil. And just remembering that like we have to figure out, and, you know, I talk a lot in we's, I should be more specific about who I'm talking about, but folks who are invested in anti-imperial struggle, anti-capitalist struggle, collective liberation, like we need to hold on to the things that we know are true as we move forward and not allow for this chatter. Like I'm already seeing people allow for the chatter to derail them, and being like really clear-eyed about the long-term future that we're all fighting for. And it is the end of this US Zionist imperial monster that is responsible for the genocide in Gaza, is responsible for the constant destruction in the Swana region, the, you know, violence that we're seeing domestically and have since the inception of the United States, and just remembering what we are fighting for, and not allowing ourselves to be myopic.
Yeah. And that the history hasn't, like, it's not done. It's not foreclosed. That's the imagination part.
Yeah.
Michelle, go ahead.
Well, I think for me, the one big part, and this is a bit to follow up on what we're doing now, is to keep making it normal to talk about the evil, about empire, and to, as I was reading earlier, this new article, Teaching Palestine, is as academics is to find all possible ways to write and to teach about Palestine. Now, I really don't see myself teaching any course whatsoever at MIT or elsewhere where I would talk about what Palestine needs in terms of liberation, and I have to make it normal for students and hopefully my colleagues who seem to be much more timid than the students, to be able to talk about it, you know. And I think that the more of us do that, I think the more power we have, because there is, you know, they can fire Maura, they can take me out of linguistics, but can they really fire all of us? You see, and this is the strength that we have that we haven't used yet to as much as we should, which is to all of us to speak up. And I'm hoping that podcasts like this one, where we dig so deeply into these psychic inversions, I hope that academics will be able to understand that they themselves are suffering from it, and we have to get rid of it, you know. And personally, as a Haitian, you know, having grown up for 19 years believing that, my native language was not language, and being able to, as an academic, being able to get out of this state of mental slavery. I think it's possible. I think we each have this potential, once we keep seeing the truth, to get out of our cave and see, oh gosh, we've been lied throughout. And in my case, this, which is something that I also find quite ironic, is while teaching about the Caribbean that I discovered Palestine. I was lucky enough that in one of my classes, I had a student, actually, although she came as a student, but I never thought of her as a student, Viviane Sensour, Palestinian, who helped me understand the deep connections between the history of Haiti and that of Palestine. You see, and what she made us understand in this installment of my course a couple of years ago, before October 7th, was that Palestine has been silenced in so many ways in academia. And our task is to unsilence it any way we can. You see, and I think if we manage to do that, if each of us would teach in the humanities, be it economics, linguistics, anthropology, history, actually, especially history, and here I think about this association of historians who's blocking this resolution for Palestine. But that's our task. That's what we can do, and that's what I hope that eventually we'll do, even here at MIT.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Normalize, like you're saying, and then denormalize violent conditions like Zionism,
Exactly.
like imperialism, like capitalism. Michel, did you want to say about your upcoming book? Because it's about what you're talking about.
Yes, exactly. So exactly. So my upcoming book with MIT Press, actually, this is the book. Actually, it's a bit of a sad story, because this is the book that I mentioned in my course proposal. So when I proposed this course on December 5th, 2023, teaching about Palestine, I said that I wanted to use ideas from that book in progress to teach the seminar. And I suspect that might be the only case at MIT, maybe there's another one, I don't know, of a professor being told that they cannot teach about research they're doing for their own book. That to me is really, but anyway, but the book is coming out in fall 26, and it's both academic, but it's also very biographical. It's called Our Own Language, The Power of Haitian Creole and Other Mother Tongues for Liberation. And what I do in that book is to look at my own history as a colonized Haitian, understanding that, my mind was infected. Back then I called it mental colonization, but I was really colonized in a deep way, and getting out of it, and then creating this initiative called MIT Haiti Initiative, where we've been promoting now for the past 15 years or so, the power of Creole, for equal opportunity. We have this saying in Haiti, tout moun c'est moun. Tout moun c'est moun means everyone is human. And everyone cannot be human if your language is devalued. And we show that this is the same throughout the world. There are all these cases in the Americas, in Europe, in Africa, in Israel and Palestine, of course, where language is used as an index of humanity. And it's used in such a pernicious way that often those who are colonized or oppressed, it's very hegemonic. It's exactly what Gramsci described, that the oppressed adopt the values of the oppressor and oppress themselves. So until we get to understand the mechanics of this oppression, we'll always be colonized. So the goal of the book is to help speakers, educators, policymakers to undo the structures of oppression. So very, very much a book inspired by Frantz Fanon, Cheikh Anta Diop, thinkers who understand the power of language education for liberation.
Oh, I can't wait to read it. And I love getting your emails in Creole too. It's about normalize. That's part of the reason why I always put my name in Arabic. I have my signature, and that they seem like such small things.
Yeah.
And then one Zionist so-called colleague was like, it was so scary when she came online on Zoom and there was Arabic in her name. They actually said that. Maura, so it tells you everything you need to know. Even
That's
our
right.
names scare them, folks.
That's
Even
right.
our language and its characters, because they're so, saturated by their own projections of violence. Maura, did you want to talk about your work and your upcoming?
Sure, I'll say something really quickly about that. But the funny thing about, it's not funny, but the thing about language is the only language or script that I think we should really be thinking about in terms of the violence that it does is modern Hebrew, which is not just like, a creation of the Zionist state, but also is like literally used as a weapon on the bodies of Palestinians. So it's really incredible to see, as they say, every accusation is a confession. So my obsession, I truly believe that like my own positionality means that the work that I need to be doing is destroying Zionist institutions in the ways that I can. And so I'm working on a book about Hillel International and a larger history of campus Zionist repression. So sort of beginning after the first Intifada, but really thinking about after 9/11, the changing landscape of the United States and sort of the capture of campuses by the Israel lobby. So hopefully I'll be out in 2027 with Interlink Press.
Cannot wait. These folks are awesome. Follow their work. And I'm posting also a journal article that Michel just passed along to me that came out. In this episode notes, you will see some of their writing. Follow them on socials. We will come back together, hopefully, and do this again, continue the conversation. I am sure it does not end here. I am sure Zionism and its aggressions in tandem with the imperial core are not going to end here. Thank you so much, folks, for joining us. We had awesome chat as always. Please subscribe to the channel, pass this along to folks. It will be immediately populated on our YouTube channel, but make sure folks know what's happening and know these two wonderful comrades who I hold extremely dear. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for creating
Thank you.
these spaces.
Of course.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.